السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام, Dr. Abdullah. I'm good.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
How are you, Dr. Atif?
Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, doing well. How's Melbourne and Australia?
Yeah, it's pretty warm at the moment.
That's great. I believe the summer started.
Yeah, it started. Alhamdulillah.
What the temperature now?
It should be around mid-20s, but it'll reach 40 in a few days, I'm sure.
Okay. So we hope that you will join us maybe next time. We're having our winter around 13
Inshallah.
degrees, and the weather here is very beautiful.
Yes, inshallah.
Inshallah. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today and sharing your valuable experience. And I am sure that will add a great knowledge to all the audience.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Right. So at the moment, I'm unable to share my screen, but I would like to introduce Professor Atif Ahmad. So I welcome you all to the first workshop organized by Saudi Aramco Cybersecurity Chair. And for today's workshop, we have the title Cybersecurity Attacks and Defense in Organization, a Strategic Management Perspective. And for today's workshop, we have the pleasure to be with Dr. Atif, who is an associate professor at the University of Melbourne's School of Computing and Information Systems, where he serves as the Deputy Director of the Academic Center of Cybersecurity Excellence. Professor Atif leads a unique team of cybersecurity management researchers drawn from information systems, business administration, security intelligence, and information warfare. He has authored over 100 scholarly articles in security management and received over 5 million Australian dollars in grant funding. Dr. Atif is an associate editor for the leading IT security journal, Computers and Security. He has previously served as a cybersecurity consultant for Worley Pearson and Slink Knight Merge. Atif is also a certified protection professional with the American Society for Industrial Security. Today's workshop, you might have some idea, we have 4 sessions. The first will be a regular workshop, followed by a question answer session. You are free to raise your hands and we will give you an opportunity to ask the speaker if you have any question. After that, we will be having a case study followed by the question answer session. So in total, it will be 2 hours session. Now I welcome Professor Atif to take it from here, please.
Okay, let me check first. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, Doctor.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Abdullah Al-Muhaidib, the College Dean and Supervisor of Saudi Aramco Cybersecurity Chair, Imam Abdulrahman bin Faisal University, for the invitation, and Professor Nasra Minallah for moderating the session. Hello, welcome, and salamu alaikum to all the participants. Thank you for making time to attend this presentation. I understand that we have a broad spectrum of attendees, from practitioners to researchers, students to experts, and I really hope that you will derive a lot of significant benefit from this presentation. Let me start with a few words about my discipline background. I started off as a technologist in software engineering, computer science, and then did my PhD in computer forensics. And at that point, I then switched to an industry, a series of industry experiences for Worley Parsons, Sinclair Knight Merce, Pinkertons. And during that time, I dropped my technological focus and became a strategic management consultant. I then came back to the University of Melbourne and established a special research team, a very unique research team, I must say, that studies how organizations practice cybersecurity, which is very different from the normal type of, the conventional research paradigm, which is to do technical research in cybersecurity. So today I'm really pleased to present some very exciting research. that our team has recently completed. So why is this research exciting? Let me start by saying, if you're monitoring the news, you'll be very well aware that cybersecurity attacks are on the rise. You'll also be aware that the level of organization and sophistication of cybersecurity attacks, in terms of the sophistication of the tools, the techniques, the methods, it's increased to a level where we might want to call it, military grade. And in many cases, the threat actors, the actors that are doing these cyber attacks, are nation state actors, or they're sponsored by nation states. And the victims are commercial entities, private enterprise. So the question that I'm going to pose to you, a question that I'd like you to keep in the front of your mind throughout this presentation, is how can organizations, private enterprise, respond to organized and sophisticated attacks, right? This is the key question that, from our perspective, from our team's perspective, is the burning question of today's day and age, right? How does private enterprise survive in a threat landscape that is so militarized that the natural advantage is to the attacker and to their military grade weaponry and techniques, and the disadvantage is to private enterprise, right? So how do you survive in an environment like that? How do you conduct your business? How do you survive? How do you thrive? Those are the questions that we have asked ourselves over the last 5 to 10 years. So what is really special about this presentation is that we were very fortunate to have been invited into one of Australia's iconic financial institutions, right, to study their cybersecurity practice. This is a firm that has survived many nation state-based attacks and has acquired a certain level of maturity in its practice that most of its peers, most other banks, financial institutions, insurance agencies, telecommunications organizations, they all agree that this organization is probably the leading organization in the region, right? So you can only imagine how excited we were to get this kind of invitation. And we have been doing, field case studies for the last 15 years, right? Over 40 case studies. And it was the first time that we got an opportunity to spend 3 months inside the leading organization so that we could study how the entire organization practiced cybersecurity, from level 1 incident responders all the way to the chief information security officer. And the publication that we got out of this, which is published in Computers and Security in 2021, is probably the first field study of a leading exemplar organization where you can clearly see how the whole organization responds when it's under attack, right? That kind of field study is very rare. And if you look at, if you have an idea of the literature base here, there are very few case studies, empirical case studies in the research literature. And most of them actually only report organizations that are struggling with basic security, right? They're doing, some of them are doing security, well in certain areas, but on others, but you wouldn't say that any of them are leading exemplar organization. They set the gold standard. And I guess it's kind of important here to also mention that industry standards, the ISO 27000 standards and all other standards, even the NICE standards, NIST, etc., they give general directives, general guidance on how organizations should respond to attack. But nowhere do we get a very clear view of what the gold standard is, of how do teams work together? What are the processes? What are the technologies that are using? How are they integrated? How does, instant response work from a process perspective, a practice perspective over time? We don't get this view at all. And this is the first time that we have this view in research. So I'm very excited about this. And that's what the plan is today. Okay, so very quickly, the overview of today's presentation. There are 4 sessions, as Professor Nasr actually described. The first session is going to be me talking about the foundational ideas that underpin strategic views of cybersecurity management, right? And after that, I'm going to open it up to questions, 10 minutes, where you can ask me whatever you would like about the strategic view. And then after the 10-minute Q&A session, we'll move to the case study, where I'll describe in detail what we saw inside that organization and what are the lessons that we learned from a research and from a practice perspective, and then another 10-minute Q&A session. Inshallah, I'll try to keep to time. The main learning objectives for this presentation is we would like you to understand the role of cybersecurity in organizations. Even if you're a cybersecurity researcher, you might have been in this area for 10 years, for 15 years, but I can almost say for certain, if you've got a technology perspective, then there's a lot to learn about the organizational perspective, right? So understanding what the role of cybersecurity is from the organization's perspective is very interesting. The second major objective is the ability to analyze strategic level security objectives. The third is to understand the nature of the challenge that threat actors pose to organizations. And then to know about what the controls are, what's the range of controls that organizations have at their disposal, and then what's the strategy, what's the overarching strategy that the organization will use to defend itself against attacks, right? Okay. So let's start. This is the first and the most important slide actually of the whole pack, right? It's a very simple slide. It's a conceptual framework, right? And this is perhaps the most, in simple terms, the clearest perspective you can get on what is security, right? Not even what is cybersecurity, but what is security, right? Security is basically about protecting something of value. On the left-hand side, you see the term asset. An asset basically here represents an item of value. For there to be a security problem, you must have something of value, and you must have some kind of danger or threat to that value, which is the threat, as you see on the right-hand side. So this arrow that goes from the right to the left is basically the threat and the influence or the impact that the threat has on an asset, okay? So that's the driver. So for a security problem, you must have an asset and you must have a threat. Now, for every threat that exists for an asset, so if you map every type of threat actor or every threat vector to a particular asset, you get a risk scenario, right? So for example, a human attacker exploits a vulnerability in a particular server to launch an attack on an e-commerce service, which basically goes down and the organization suffers impact, right? That's one risk scenario. Right. And you can imagine now that in an organization, especially a multinational organization with hundreds of thousands of assets, there will be a huge number of scenarios. The whole point of security is to try to control those scenarios, right? And we control them using a range of security controls, formal controls, informal controls, technological controls. We'll go through those in due course. But at the end of the day, the reason why we're spending so much time on this model is to basically say this. Although from a dictionary perspective, security is the absence of harm to something of value, from an organizational perspective, security is a process where you find the balance between the value that these assets give you as an organization and the risk exposure you incur from the threats that operate in your environment, right? Given that you have very few resources, you don't have unlimited resources, and you cannot eliminate all risk, security is basically finding a balance between risk exposure and control. So the problem is left to right, but the solution is top down, right? Solution is about how much risk exposure can you tolerate as an organization, and how much investment do you make into security controls to manage that risk exposure. Right? This is what every organization is thinking about at a strategic level if they're doing security well. Now, that's a very simple view. Here's the complicated view. See, there are two types. If you ask the basic question, what is the role of IT and information in my organization? You'll start to get some interesting answers depending on which organization, or which type of organization you're talking about. Basically, there are two categories. IT and information are used as either in a transactional sense or in a transformational sense. What does that mean? That means that in the vast majority of organizations, and I would hazard a guess that 99% of organizations in Saudi Arabia are transactional organizations, right? They use IT infrastructure to run their business or their processes on, right? So the primary role for IT is as a service. Either it's running e-commerce, or it's running power, or it's running water, or it's running banking or telecommunications. These are all services, and they run on IT infrastructure. The other major asset in transactional organizations is data. So either it's customer data or employee data, but there's lots of sensitive data floating around, and it could be even the CEO's confidential communications. So sensitive emails, sensitive strategy reports. But in transactional organizations, you basically got two assets. You got IT services, which have to keep running. If they're disrupted, then there's an impact, or it's sensitive information. There is one other type of organization that is endlessly fascinating, right? And that's the organization for which IT has a transformational use, right? And these are organizations that are either advanced manufacturing. So think about car manufacturers, airplane manufacturers, anything where the item that's being manufactured is unique, or software companies. So they're developing new types of new software, that's their intellectual property, or pharmaceutical or med technology, which is, for example, we're talking about COVID a lot nowadays. The vaccine, the formula for the vaccine is intellectual property, right? So imagine this, you've got a pharmaceutical firm that spends maybe 10 years, invests $1 billion to develop the cure for cancer, right? Their primary asset is not their IT services, the fact that their IT machines are running. It's the formula, right, that sits in the R&D division. If somebody steals the formula, which is information, the whole organization can collapse because they've invested so much money and they make no profit until their drug reaches the shelves, right? So on the right-hand side, the primary asset is intellectual property, trade secrets, right? And that's sensitive information, but it's a particular category of sensitive information. And of course, IT services, because they too run digital platforms, right? And in fact, even R&D, like these COVID, the cure for cancer, the cure for COVID, is being experimented on and developed using IT systems. On the left-hand side, there's a very interesting iceberg model, which basically says, what's the impact of an attack? There's obvious ones. The fact that if you have an attack, you've got to do an investigation. You've got to tell customers that there's been a breach. You've got to have regulatory compliance reports, public relations nightmare. You've got to pay lawyers, and you've got to improve your cybersecurity. But there's also, beneath the obvious, there's some not so obvious impacts. If you've got insurance, your premium will rise. If you've been taking on debt, then your cost of taking on more debt will rise. You're going to have impact to your operations, which requires productivity, which is productivity losses, and you need to regain that. Your customers will lose trust in you. You'll lose contract revenue because you'll lose a lot of opportunities for more contracts. Your trade name will be devalued, and most of all, your IP, if it is lost, cannot be replaced, right? So here are a whole range of different types of things that can happen to you if you have an attack. So the critical question is, what are my assets? And I'll tell you this, the most interesting thing here, most organizations have no clue how many assets they have, where they are in the organization, and they can't find them, right? And most organizations also don't know what the short, medium, and long-term impact of a cyber attack is. They can usually tell what the impact is immediately, but what happens after 3 months or 6 months? That's very hard to measure. So what is the role? What's the key strategic objective of cybersecurity? Is to protect information resources so the business can function. What does that mean? Usually two things. Maintain IT service availability. That means your e-commerce services need to be running, your email needs to be running, your database services need to be running, your web services need to be running, your AWS services need to be running. Those are all important, but also protection of information, right? That's the question you need to ask. Every strategic management person needs to ask themselves, what is the role of IT? What is the role of information in enabling me, my organization, to achieve its organizational objectives? That definition, what is the role of IT and information, will tell you what is the impact of security breaches, because that's directly related to the role of IT. Okay, so let's quickly talk about threat actors. Okay, this is a really interesting diagram that actually I pulled from an ISACA manual. It maps risk versus attack capability, really, right? And the value of this really is to understand the differences between 4 categories of attackers. You've got amateur attackers on the extreme left. You've got hackers who are somewhat professional. You've got insiders working against your organization from the inside. And then you've got the really organized attackers, right? Think of these as your commandos, right? Your cyber commandos. They're very organized. They're very sophisticated. In fact, the team has come together, with individuals who were selected to attack a particular organization. And you can imagine if you're an organization, you just bought a series of firewalls, then maybe on that team that's attacking you, you've got the engineers who made those firewalls, right? So it's not unheard of for these teams to recruit people who have inside knowledge of the organization's defenses so they can get through them easily. Okay, now, what does this map actually tell us? It's interesting because it says to us on the extreme left that your unsophisticated script kiddies or amateurs basically pose very little exposure, right? They're very little exposure to the organization, right? And the reason why is because they're basically replicating or doing attacks that have already existed. So if you, as a competent organization, have all the regular, cyber defenses, then anybody who attacks you using attacks that have been seen before are not going to get anywhere. And that's what script kiddies do. They have zero capability to experiment and to innovate. They just repeat other people's attacks. Okay. As soon as you get to now attacker category number 2, who are after you because you've got something they want, then they begin to use more innovative techniques, right? They will experiment a bit more. They will do their recon. They'll study your environment. They may take 3 months. They may take 6 months, and then they'll execute their plan of attack, right? And that could be ransomware. That could be theft of IP. That could be disruption of your IT services, right? But as we go up, insiders are more dangerous than most hackers because they're already inside your perimeter. They have authorized access frequently to valuable assets, and you trust them. So if they exploit or abuse that trust, and they do so for personal gain, then you won't have defenses internally because most of your defenses are sitting on the perimeter or the boundary between the trusted environment and the untrusted environment. But we're not interested in these 3 categories. We're interested in the 4th, what we call APT. Now, I know a lot of people think or consider APT to be a technical type of attack, but we are here defining APT as a group of threat actors, right? So commandos, think of people. They're, advanced and persistent actors. What is different about APT is the fact that they're so well-resourced, they're so organized, they're so sophisticated, and they're very well sponsored, okay? And this red arrow is really the point of this whole graph. Their ability, the ability of APTs to experiment is what makes them so dangerous. Right? They will find ways around your defenses because they can innovate. They'll come up with new types of attacks that nobody has ever invented. And you can think zero-day attacks or a combination of zero-day attacks. The point is, your cyber defenses as an organization are built using attacks that have been seen before most of the time, right? They're not built for new types of attacks. And APTs are exactly that. They have this ability to do new types of attacks. So in most cases, your defenses are completely blind to those sorts of attacks. The question, though, the important question here is, the organization needs to ask themselves, who might be after their assets? What are they after? What do they want? What's their means? What's their motivation? What's their capability to achieve their objectives? And how might they achieve their objectives, right? This is what is most interesting for us, right, as organizational defenders. Now, as you might be noticing, what we're doing here is we're going through each of these. So we're talked about the asset and what that means for different types of organizations. Now we talked about the threat. What are the different threat actors? Now we're going to talk about understanding how these stack up in terms of risk. Okay, so very simply put, on the left-hand side, you've got threat actors, And this is basically a side-on view of your defenses. And conceptually, we can represent these as physical technological defenses, process defenses, people defenses, what's going on inside your organization, and instant response as a defense, right? And this is a really interesting model. It's called the Swiss cheese model because it basically says that every defense that you institute or acquire, whether you buy or you implement, is going to have holes in it, just by its very nature. There's no such thing as a defense without holes. And the point here is, if the holes in one category of defense aligns with holes in other categories of defenses, then, and a threat actor is able to exploit those holes, then they'll get through your defenses and they'll create an impact. And at that point, you have to try to respond, but even your response has holes in it. So the question is, do you know what your holes are? And are you very well, in a sense, aware of how to prevent that alignment from happening, right? I realize people might be putting their hands up. We'll deal with those in questions and answers because we're on a roll here. On the right-hand side, you basically have a simple type of calculation that a lot of strategists will make. They'll look at the threat actor and they'll look at all the barriers that vector is going to meet when it tries to propagate through the organization. And the question there then is, how many barriers do you have for a threat actor, and do they complement each other? Do they work together or do they work against each other, right? So what's my threat profile? What's my controls profile? And do my controls work together to give me the best possible defense for the amount of investment that I've made, right? That's the question. Okay. And on top of those process, physical, and technological barriers is governance, right? And governance is very important because it sets a framework of rules and relationships and systems and processes within which your organization can be organized, right? You have risk management, whose primary role is to identify those scenarios and then to prioritize those scenarios measured by probability and impact, and then to determine how best to leverage your investment to reduce the risk exposure that you have. And then you've got policies, policies are somewhat complicated, beasts, but they give direction to you. They define the key roles in the organization. They define what is allowed and what is not allowed in terms of behavior and so forth. And then training, which is your primary way of changing people's behavior, right? Is to improve their awareness, improve their education, improve their training. And we'll talk about that right now, right? So what is training and education and awareness? They're three different things. Awareness is basically when you have information that sits at the front of your mind, right? So security is important, right? And you'll have seen like t-shirts with security is important, or, loose lips sink ships, or don't tell your password to anybody. That's awareness. That's constantly reminding people about just using information to keep at the front of their mind. Training is about skills, trying to give people skills. For example, how do you run antivirus software? How do you identify a virus? How do you do basic remediation? Those are training things. And then education is about insight. It's about, how do you develop a strategy? How do you develop practices? How do you deal with new types of threats that you haven't seen before, right? That's education. So E, T, and A are the three big vectors for your behavior change in organizations. Okay, so let's talk about maturity for a moment. I've taken this from Gartner. It's an old, graph, but it's still kind of relevant. It's talking to what are the 5 stages of maturity in an organization. Level 1 is basically an organization where they really have no, sort of awareness of what is security. It's for them, IT is like an air conditioner. As long as it's blowing cold air and it's working, and that's fine. As soon as the air conditioner stops working and it stops and you start feeling the heat, that's when you go, oh, hold on, security. What about security? The IT system's gone down. Oh, we've been ransomware attacked. All our IT systems are locked up. We need to think about security. That's when they wake up. So in level 1, there's no visibility into what their critical risks are. They're very focused on, IT services just need to keep running. And they really don't wake up until either the regulator taps them on the shoulder and says, hey, do you have a policy? Do you have a plan? Or there's a massive incident or something causes them to wake up. Okay. So level one, what's security or what is security, right? Level two, they know that they don't have security, but they have no idea how bad the situation is, right? So at this point, they go, oh, let's do an assessment. Let's do a gap analysis. Let's do a risk assessment. Let's do a vulnerability assessment. And then they start forming teams. And that might be just the IT manager saying, oh, IT manager, you now are also security manager, right? Do you have a policy? No, let's copy and paste from our friend or our competitor or our, somebody from the supply chain. Create a charter, assess the current state, and then they move to level three, which is, we have done an assessment. It's pretty informal. We need to formalize things. So let's start creating processes. Let's create a risk register. Let's do our risk assessments every 6 months, every year. Let's try closing those gaps. Let's create a governance committee, or let's create some kind of committee that takes responsibility. And then level four. This is when it becomes patently clear that security shouldn't be sitting just in IT stack, right? The security is bigger than IT. It's about the whole enterprise. And security needs to report to the executive level. And there needs to be some understanding of what performance means. How do you measure cybersecurity performance in the organization? And yes, we've invested a lot of money into risk management, risk mitigation, but what happens with the leftover risk? What do we do with that? And what about the business part of the organization, right? How do we engage business? How do we get them to pay attention to cybersecurity, right? It's not just a technology problem, it's a business problem. And then level five, and I think there's a level six, but level five is basically when they go, oh, business needs to drive security, not technology, right? The whole enterprise needs to be engaged. We need to integrate security into every aspect of the organization. And we need to have strategic level decision-making that drives the cybersecurity objectives and performance, right? That's supposed to be level five, but there is level six, right? Which Gartner is not aware of, but our research tells us, which is where organization now introduces threat intelligence as a way of being, right? So compliance, no good. Compliance is important, but compliance, all the compliance in the world is not going to protect you against a sophisticated threat actor, right? And compliance creates generic defenses, right? Everybody's complying with ISO standards. Well, everybody's defenses looks the same, right? We need threat intelligence, and we need threat intelligence to create custom defenses, right? So level six is customization of your defenses to your threat environment, right? Which I would say is level six. Okay. Now, last slide in this, the most important slide that leads on to the next phase. Okay. So what is the strategy? Well, if you look at it from the bird's eye view perspective, right? So think about the CEO or the CISO, where the CISO is not an IT manager, right? Think about it from the CEO, the CIO, somebody's really high up in the organization looking down. Basically, cybersecurity is about two things. It's about prevention. Let's prevent cyber attacks from affecting our organization. Yes, and I'm including accidents in there too, right? But let's build a shield around the organization to protect the organization from attacks, right? That's part one. However, we need to understand that from time to time, the shield is going to get penetrated, right? And when it gets penetrated, we need to have a response capability. That's number two, right? So ultimately, you build a shield, the shield gets penetrated, and then you build the response capability to patch the shield and to restore the organization to routine practices. Now, this is the part where we kind of now take off or diverge from the normal narrative. Everything that I've said so far, any person in business and cybersecurity will acknowledge. Now, here's the part that is pure research and not in any textbook, right? And that is, if you look really carefully at this diagram here at the bottom, this is the standard incident response practice. It says that when you suffer an incident, you need to detect the incident. You need to diagnose what kind of incident. You need to contain the incident from spreading. You need to eradicate the root cause of the incident and then restore the organization to its routine behavior, and then do a post-mortem to study what happened, why it happened, what could you do better, and submit and prepare for the next incident by drawing on those insights. And this is the whole cycle. Okay. Now, this cycle is being driven by compliance, right? The compliance mentality, which says that once you have an incident, you basically need to put out the fire and go back to normal routine business. The problem with this approach is that it completely ignores the threat environment. It just says, well, I can deal with the incident, each incident separately, or maybe even in tandem. But all I really need to know is more about these incidents and what is going on inside our organization, right? Now, we know that in the last 5 years or so, or 10 years, the kill chain model, MITRE's attack framework, all these frameworks have come that have said, hold on, wait a second, the attacker has a process as well. They are studying, doing recon, they're penetrating organization, they're mobilizing, they're getting to their target, and then they are, taking off and going to the next organization, right? There is actually a pattern there too. And a lot of organizations are aware of that. But what do we not understand? What do we not understand is that risk isn't just about incidents happening or the probability or the impact of the incident. It's about the intentionality of the attacker, right? And what we don't quite understand here is that this model doesn't actually work, right? Because if you think about the COVID vaccine, you think of COVID as a disease, right? All of the, medical emergency teams, they basically do exactly this model. They detect the type of disease, they diagnose it, they contain it, they eradicate it, and they do their postmortem, right? But a disease is a natural event behind which there's no intelligence, right? So, well, we hope there's no intelligence behind COVID, right? A cyber threat actor has intelligence. So they are moving on a chessboard each of these incidents, right? These attacks are actually part of a plan. And if you as an organization don't actually recognize who the threat actor might be, where they're coming from and what their objectives are, you can put out incidents forever and you will not actually be any further. You'll just be a firefighter without understanding what the objective is and how to combat the objective, right? And this is the point of this entire presentation. How do you graduate from simply putting off fires and responding to incidents in a simple way to moving to a point where you are now focused on the threat actor behind the incidents and combating the threat actor, right? How do we do that? That's the whole point. Okay, so the critical question, what is driving my prevention and response behavior? Is it compliance or is it threat intelligence, right? That's the critical question. Okay, so that's the end of the first session, and we can now take questions, inshallah.
Thanks, Professor Atif. It was a very interesting first part. I like the asserts and its impact, and especially I like the threat environment. And I was really pleased to see the questions you highlighted at the end of the slide. I was able to connect the question with the slides. So thank you very much. Now I have a few questions. I'll ask them first, and then I will ask the participants to ask live questions. So the first question is about what are the biggest cybersecurity threats right now, especially in the Melbourne? We heard a lot of cybersecurity attacks during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think this question is for everywhere. I mean, COVID-19 is all over the globe. So what are the biggest threats that you can see in the near future or even at present?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I think we all know what the basic, what the major cyber attacks are, right? There's the ransomware attacks, there's, disruption of IT services, there's critical infrastructure-based attacks, there's, people's personal information being stolen, there's, identity theft. All of those attacks that exist everywhere in the world also exist here in Australia. But for me, these are not interesting attacks, right? I'm not saying that they're not impactful. I mean, for the victim, this is extremely impactful. But from a research point of view, what are the most interesting categories or types of attacks? The ones that are interesting for me are the ones that have, that are multi-stage attacks. So, for example, attacks that are focused on destabilizing the financial system of the entire country, right? So, for example, there was a recent attack on New Zealand, and it starts off normally as a denial of service attack. A lot of these sophisticated attacks, and the point of denial of service is to create a fog of confusion, right? A huge denial of service attack against the entire banking and finance infrastructure of New Zealand, right? And that basically then ties up a lot of the incident response teams that are managing the infrastructure, right? And then after that, using the fog of denial of service as a cover, then they're targeted attacks, right? And it takes then organizations, see, this is the point, the organizations that don't have the ability to you can say, identify what's fog and what's the you can say misdirection from the actual attack are the ones that suffer the most, right? So the most sophisticated attacks, and when we come to the case study, we'll talk specifically about this. The most sophisticated organizations are the ones that have automated the clearing of the fog. And they can see what is above the fog or through the fog that is actually directed at specific assets. And those are the ones that I think are the most interesting ones, right? For Australia, we have one big advantage, which is most, particularly with banking and finance, sophisticated attacks start in the US, then they go to Europe, then they come to Australia. So there's about a 6-month lag between the innovation of attack from the US to Europe to Australia. However, there is one important point here, and that is that some attacks are tailor-made to particular organizations. So you can't use general trends as any indicator. Okay, that's my answer. Next question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atif. It was indeed a nice and insightful seminar from your side. I have one question. Since I worked on the security of SMEs in Saudi Arabia in one of my articles, so since we know that human is the weakest link in any organization to leak the security and to invite the threats in any organization, right? So I was thinking to design a framework for a Saudi organization that what are the training needs for them. So in comparison with the Australian framework of security training and needs, what do you suggest for Saudi Arabia, that what kind of training should we design for them so that to minimize and mitigate the security attacks, cybersecurity attacks on the SMEs of Saudi economy?
Interesting question. First thing I would suggest to you, Mahmoud, I think it is.
Yes, Maqsood Mahmoud, yes.
Maqsood Mahmoud, sorry. First thing I would suggest to you is training. Let's first start with your assumptions. Is the human the weakest link?
It is considered to be, yeah. It is considered to be.
Yeah. So let me sort of respond to this widespread belief that humans are the weakest link. Yes, it is true that humans are the weakest link. They're usually the weakest link because they create opportunities for attackers to get inside the organization. They're not the weakest link because the organization, is most vulnerable to a particular human, right? It's just that humans create opportunities, and they're very difficult to manage in terms of their behavior. Technology can be purchased, can be designed, can be configured. Humans cannot be designed and configured the way technologies can. So yes, in that sense, you're right. The problem, though, is that most cybersecurity training strategies are not looking at the environment, where the people are functioning. So my short answer to you, Maqsood, is in order to come up with a training program, you need to understand the human problem first. So it's a culture issue, okay? There's a general issue, which is behavior of IT professionals and industry professionals in organizations. There's the national cultural issue, and there's the socio-organizational cultural issue. Until you understand what is the problem with this behavior, you can't really come up with a training strategy. Okay. So if you take a general framework from Australia and you try to apply it to Saudi Arabia, you're going to have the problem, of course, that the framework has been created in the sort of very generalist sense. And then you're also going to have the problem that it's created for people that exist in an environment with very low power distance index, right? So I'm not sure if you're aware of the term power distance index. It's the amount of power that a superior has over a subordinate, right? So the countries with the lowest power distance index are, for example, the US, Europe, Australia. The countries with the highest power in distance index are like Malaysia, Indonesia, where superiors or supervisors have a lot of power over their subordinates. Okay, this has a huge impact on how cybersecurity is practiced. So, short answer: sure, use those frameworks. However, look into the research around security culture and training, and come up and look up Dr. Munir Al-Sheikh's work, specifically in training and awareness. He's done this really interesting study on Telstra, which is an Australian the national telecommunications carrier. He's done an interesting study on their culture and come up with a training program. And Dr. Munir is Saudi, so you can contact him through me. And he's probably thinking about the same things that you're thinking. Okay. Next question, please.
Thank you very much.
Right. So, Professor Atif, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So there's one more question. It came from the registration of the attendees. The question is about the certification. She's asking which is the most relevant certification that we can do for regarding defense in organizations. Like, she's asking that what kind of certifications are related to defense in organization. So what is your take on it?
So let me start by saying that I'm not a fan of certifications, right? And they're a means to an end, sure. I think originally when certifications came out as a thing, they were designed to give organizations assurance that professionals that they're hiring have a certain amount of experience and capability. But what they've turned out to be is aspirational. People who want to get a job or want to get certain experiences or build certain capability, do certifications as a bridge to that or an entry to that. So I'm not a fan of certifications in principle, and I certainly can't comment on individual certifications because the certification that I did myself is called Certified Protection Professional, which is non-IT. It's actually physical military certification, and it taught me about strategy and tactics and operations, which I found much more useful, which I think is much more useful than the cyber ones. But the short answer to your question is, if you want to know what is the best certification for you to take, it's the certification that's going to get you into the organization where you'll get the experiences that you need to be able to develop the capability that you want, right? So I suggest to you, work backwards, say, okay, in 10 years, what do I want to be? Do I want to be a cyber defense person, like incident response and so forth? Do I want to be a manager, a strategic level manager? And then work backwards from there to say, okay, if I want to get there, what are the job ads at the moment that advertise for the roles? What do they expect in terms of certifications and things? Let me get those, not because I think that those certifications will make me into that person, but because I need to get into the organization. Once I get into the organization, I'll get the experiences and develop the capability, and then I'll be that person, right? So I would strongly suggest that we change the way we think about certifications and even education, right? Nothing beats experience. Education is a way to open our minds and to conceptualize the world and to build those insights and strategies and the way of thinking that allows us then to leverage experiences to their best advantage, right? That's my short answer. Okay, we have another question.
Yes, so thank you, Professor Atif. So I have a question. So from technological appropriation point of view, we understand that, technologies keep on evolving in the organization, and especially theories like, integrated organizational and technological development says that organizational processes and technologies keeps on, updating and infrastructures keep on evolving. So I would like to have your take, especially when you mentioned about, level 6 with, this maturity framework. So how do you think that the security practices, security policies, all those things, how they need to be, I think, appropriated accordingly as per, organizations keep on evolving. So I would like to have your take on this point.
What does the term appropriation mean?
I mean,
it means different things.
They are
Sorry, go on.
aligning their technologies with, the organizational practices, business processes, so they are integrating, because business processes keep on evolving. Technologies need to be optimized in line with those business processes as well.
Yes, yes. So the answer in one term is cyber transformation, right? It's kind of parallel to digital transformation. So organizations are constantly evolving, technologies are changing, and unfortunately what happens is the business keeps transforming and acquiring new technologies, and the IT part of the organization. Case study, one of the biggest challenges that this organization had is basically trying to keep up with technology adoption and business transformation. Every time the organization changes and acquires new technologies, they have to study the technology to remove the vulnerabilities from it, right? Because they're bringing the technology inside the organization, right? When you buy technology, you are bringing it inside the trusted part of the organization. You are extremely vulnerable to that technology. So they spend a lot of time and a lot of energy studying the technology and testing it and integrating it to make sure that it doesn't introduce new vulnerabilities that compromises their cyber defenses, right? So this is my short answer, because we're talking about response. There's a whole nother lecture around or discussion around process transformation, innovation, adoption, and evolution of that, right? Which we really don't unfortunately have time for. Okay, I think we should move on to the next part. Is that okay?
Right. So we have questions, but I think maybe we can skip it for the time being. We're running out of time. So I think you may continue with the next case study, please.
Okay. Okay, this is now me getting excited about the case study. So let me start by introducing this organization. I cannot name the organization. I'm sure that if I would name the organization, you all know this organization, okay? It is a multinational financial organization with a market capitalization of 60 billion Australian dollars. They operate in 34 countries. They serve 9 million customers worldwide. They employ 60,000 personnel. They are iconic, right? They're like an Australian, if you think Qantas and Australia, you can think of the equivalent in the financial industry, right? Their market position, their iconic status, and their management of large funds transfers, and their status as a national level critical infrastructure organization makes them a very high value target for advanced persistent threats, okay? Nation state-backed APTs are interested in this organization because they want to disrupt national commerce, they want to reduce trust in national financial systems, and they want to steal information about everything from what are the bank balances of all the people, of all high value individuals, to can we steal, funds through when their fund transfers are being made, to, trust between financial organizations. All these sorts of things are all part of their objectives. So what is the key driver for this organization's investment in cybersecurity? These guys basically write a blank check for cybersecurity. There's no limit to what they will spend, right? Despite being a heavily regulated sector, they realize that from year to year, they are experiencing unprecedented and escalating volume and sophistication of attacks. And they realize that within 3 to 5 years, those attacks will eventually overcome their defenses, right? And this is not just a technological problem. They understand that the militarization of the threat landscape has created a new adversarial reality in their organization, and it's rendered obsolete the compliance model, right? All the compliance in the world is not going to help them, because they understand that compliance only creates generic defenses, and they need custom defenses to defend themselves against the particular types of attackers that are attacking them. So they need a new model of cyber defense, one where the whole enterprise is involved, not just the IT operations division, okay? And the problem is that the organization, the vast majority of the organization, the business part of the organization, does not quite understand the adversarial reality. They work 9 to 5. They think that because they're in the civilian, part of the world where there's no battle happening, there's no war happening. They think that everything is well and good. Whereas the cybersecurity teams feel like they are in a wartime environment. And those two different socio-organizational behaviors has a key role to play here. Okay, so very interesting for us is when we went to study this organization, they had recently undergone a significant structural change. They had removed their middle management entirely so that they had executive management and they had operations teams. And their operations teams are highly, highly motivated teams that are collaborative and self-directed, and they don't need middle management for direction. They report directly to senior management or executives. Okay. Now, on the slide, you see here that we interviewed 6 people, and getting access to such an organization, as you can imagine, is very difficult. We were fortunate to have access to 6 people. These are the key people that we thought would give us the clearest view in the organization. That is the lead cybersecurity operations, the lead person for cybersecurity operations, the lead person for the security operations center, which you can see on the right-hand side. Basically, a security operations center is a organization within an organization. It's got 3 levels. Level 1 are incident responders, junior incident responders. Level 2 are middle or medium level incident responders. Level 3 are senior incident responders, and they together form the operations center. The job of the operations center is to monitor the threat environment, the incident environment, and to detect attacks and to diagnose them and to create situation awareness, and then to pass the response job on to a different IT operations team. Okay. And I created this diagram in this way specifically to show the disconnect between IT operations division and business divisions, right? This is true of every organization in the world. IT operations is always separate to the business. There's always a disconnect. If you want to study the disconnect, there's a whole series of fantastic research articles by the chief scientist of MIT's Sloan School of Management, Joe Peppard, which talks about business IT disconnect. Okay, but this is true of every organization. Okay, so lead security operations center. So this is the level 3 person in charge of the whole center. The lead for cybersecurity strategy across the entire organization, who is the person who invited us and is a former student of mine. Senior threat intelligence analyst who works with the security operations center. 1 person from level 1, because these are the busiest people. They're junior, but they're very busy. And then the chief information security officer. And you can see how many years of experience they've had in their current role. Okay, so the CISO had been there for 3 years, which is actually a long time for CISOs. But the key person here is a security operations lead who has been there for 5 years in this team. So he really knows what he's talking about. Okay. Now, very important slide. I'm now going to describe to you the entire capability of the organization. It's important to understand the slide because if you don't get the slide, nothing else is going to make sense. Okay, the slide is divided into 2 sections. Section on the left is prevention capability. Section on the right is response capability. This correlates with what we were talking about in the very beginning of the lecture, which is you've got assets, you've got threats, and what is the strategic cybersecurity perspective? It's basically, how do I prevent attacks from impacting the organization? And if they do, how do I respond? Okay, so let's understand the prevention capability first. The first thing we need to understand is how big a deal, the scale at which prevention is happening. Okay, this organization experiences 20 billion, I'll repeat that, 20 billion cybersecurity related data events every 24 hours. Okay, 20 billion. Think about that as every log entry, every phishing SMS, every email that alerts them to something's going on. There's like 20 billion of these events that are related to cybersecurity, not incidents, events at an atomic technological level. Okay, this organization, as I said before, has, works across, I can't remember how many nations it was, something like 34 countries. So they've got a sprawling global heterogeneous technology estate with technologies from a range of different manufacturers, a huge network, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of technology devices, all in wide area networks, personal devices, mobile phones, corporate devices, all these devices together, huge number, and they get basically 20 billion events that they have to basically sort through every 24 hours. So they have to, for their shield, they have basically purchased every state-of-the-art firewall, intrusion detection system, antivirus software, and for each type of threat intelligence box, they've got 3 from every major vendor, right? Microsoft, Symantec, FireEye, Mandiant. They've got all the specialized tools you can imagine, and they have specific contracts with FireEye and Mandiant. And these contracts basically are the tools, the updates to the tools that if you know about FireEye, they're who the White House calls or the US Army calls if they can't handle a cyber attack, right? They're an incredible organization with all of the experiences because they're on the front lines, and they have created these specialist security tools, and all their experiences, they integrate back into their tools. So you buy the tools and you get the updates. But they also have a separate contract, which is a hotline contract, where if the cybersecurity lead gets a phone call from Mandiant or FireEye saying, are you watching what's going on? This might be about your organization, right? You only get this if you are like a top bank or a top financial institution in the world, right? So they've got that kind of relationship with FireEye. And they've got a clause in that legal relationship that says, if the organization gets overwhelmed, then FireEye will actually come into the organization and take over their IT systems and defend them actively on the ground, right? So boots on the ground sort of thing, which they have not done in the last 2 years because they can handle things themselves, but they have that option. Okay, so this is for most top tier banks and financial institutions, this is not a big deal, right? Spending all this money on it. What separates them from the other institutions is the heavy investment in the configuration and the customization of the technologies they've purchased, right? So they have dedicated machine learning teams and dedicated coding teams whose primary job is to work on the integration of the technologies in the shield. So they're constantly testing, right? So when I spoke to the operations lead, he said, look, our philosophy is to test and uplift. And what that means is, if anything changes in our organizational environment, we buy a new technology, there's new business processes, we acquire another firm, anything changes, we retest all our defenses, right? Because we don't trust the technologies. We can't see what's happening inside the technologies. So we have to test the integrations, right? So we retest the entire cyber defense. And then if there's any attack on any financial institution anywhere in the world, we will acquire that malware. Our data science teams will basically break that malware down, deconstruct it, and then develop the code to detect it, to diagnose it, and to automate the containment, the eradication, and the forensics of it. And we'll patch that into the shield. So if any time we get hit by that attack, it's automated. The whole thing is automated, and it doesn't bother us. It doesn't become part of the fog, right? So that's basically how we control the level of the volume of attacks that we experience on a day-to-day basis. Okay, that's the prevention capability. Now, let's talk about the response capability. Okay, the response capability is basically like this, and I'm going to walk you through it using these arrows, number 1 all the way to 12. Okay, basically they suck in that 20 billion events from all their platforms into what they call an enterprise data security service, which basically is a correlation aggregation technology. And that basically pushes the correlation aggregation to the SIEM platform, which is an event management platform, which does more correlation and aggregation, runs algorithms, and then basically sets up alerts on the dashboards that are visible to level 1 analysts. Okay, so think about a gigabit pipeline of incidents or events going into a series of machines that correlate them, aggregate them, and say, I think this is happening in the organization, or this is the type of incident, right? Now, there's another piece in this machine that is quite unusual because they made it themselves. And this is called the Advanced Cyber Analytics Platform. This platform is aimed at employees within the organization, and it creates signatures of every employee from the time they start their job at the firm, right, to the present moment. And the point of creating these signatures is to create a threshold where if an employee does something that's anomalous or different or unusual for their role, it will create an alarm and send that also to the Security Operations Center for investigation, right? So they're looking externally and they're looking internally for a full 360-degree view. And these alerts turn up to level 1. Now the fun begins, okay? Because these alerts, they're not usually very helpful. They come from technologies that are only guessing about what's happening, and they're very poor on context, organizational context. So level 1 analysts will have heaps of alerts. There are about 15 level 1 analysts who are working full-time around the clock at any one time, okay? And their job is to triage. Just like if you go to a hospital and you go and they start asking questions, do you have a cough? Can I do your blood pressure? This is the same thing. They will study those alerts and they'll start to collect information. They'll go to individual devices. They'll dump their logs. They'll ask questions of themselves. Okay, what's going on here? Why did this alert come? Where did it come from? What might be happening? And they've got a playbook that they'll follow, like step by step, which has been made by the level 3 analysts to say, okay, do step 1, then do step 2. And every bit of information you have, put that into a ticket management system, right? And assign a ticket number to it, and that will be visible to all the Security Operations Center. So basically, level 1's job, these guys only have like 6 months of experience. They're following the playbook. They're doing their analysis. They're using their mental models. They're creating documentation. They're sticking it into the ticket management system. Any time that they need help, they ask level 2, right? For example, is this a false positive? Is this really an incident, or could this be something else? What do you think? That's level 2. Level 3 is where you get the most senior people who have been there for 3 to 5 years. There's only 2 or 3 of them. They have advanced analytics packages where they can see patterns across the entire global IT operations, right? All 34 countries. So whereas level 1 is looking at individual devices, level 3 are looking at the entire IT real estate, okay? And what's very interesting about this organization is they created a special threat intelligence team of 4 to 6 people whose job is to take law enforcement related communications, right? Intelligence agencies, police, etc., and the special threat intelligence they get from the banking and finance community, and they distill that, and then they work at multiple levels in the Security Operations Center. They work with level 1 analysts to look at the alerts and say, okay, here's an interesting pattern. Do you think it's APT 38, or do you think it's this, or do you think it's that, or we want you to check out all these other things because it might be this actor, right? And then they work with level 3 to look at the bigger patterns and to say, okay, these are interesting patterns. And the level 3 analyst will say, is this pattern something that you've seen from a threat intelligence communication? And they'll basically connect the dots over there. Okay, so far so good. I hope this is making sense. What you're seeing now is a very well-oiled machine that works in many organizations as a Security Operations Center. Now, it is new. What's new is threat intelligence, working on level 1 and level 3, and threat intelligence also working with FireEye and their hotlines, etc. Yeah. But what's interesting for me as a strategic management researcher is what happens after the Security Operations Center has been exercised completely. So for example, if you have an attack where the organization is losing control over its IT estate, right? So a worm, for example, is propagating, and the level 3 analysts are seeing that they are losing control over subnet after subnet after subnet. And they're like, okay, we can't control this. This is out of control. We don't know how far this is going to go. This is where a new team is formed called the Security Leadership Team. And it's led by the Cybersecurity Operations Lead, the person that I spoke about a moment ago, and the strategist, cybersecurity strategy person, the one person from threat intelligence, and all the level 3 analysts. They form a special team called the Security Leadership Team, and it's formed in the moment. And this team has special powers. Okay, this is where things get very interesting. They have this 2 bridges. Bridges are like, they're like protocols that are supported with special technologies, and they come with powers. And the operations bridge is a very interesting bridge because it basically says that this team has the power to command all business heads to stop what they're doing and join the incident response team in the moment, right? So if that that incident is propagating, they can get onto the operations bridge and say, okay, business domain number 1, we want you to stop what you're doing, come into our operations room, and now explain to us, because this incident is happening in your area, what is going on, what are the business processes, how is this affected, what do you think is happening, right? And they can bring all the business heads and the heads of all IT into their team at a drop of a hat, which I must say, we've done other case studies. We've never seen an organization able to do this. And part of the reason why they can do this is because they've got no middle management, right? Otherwise, it would be a long chain of command, and this would take hours and hours and hours, if not days, to set up. So that's one operations thing they can do. The other thing they have is a management bridge. The management bridge allows them to get access to the senior executive and the board, right? And what they can do here is the CISO does not sit in the security leadership team. The CISO is deliberately sitting on the executive so that they're not compromised by this desire to push the IT agenda, right? So the CISO in the C-suite executive basically acts like their person on the executive committee. And the CISO's role is to help the security leadership team understand what the business dimension of the technology problem might be. So if they're seeing an attack on their network, the CISO might say, hold on, this might be because we're going into Thailand or into Cambodia or to or a place where there's a lot of organized crime. You don't know that we've just gotten into a business partnership, but we think there might be business reasons for the cyber attack. Okay, so what you see now is a connection between what's going on in the network and what's happening at the board level and the executive level. That we have never seen in any organization, that kind of communication, between them, and so quick and so swift, that communication. So security leadership reports to the C-suite executive, but the C-suite executive gives them strategic context so they can interpret what is happening on the network in the technology operations side of things. That is amazing, right? And that's what really got me excited about this organization, because we've never seen this happen before. Okay, so now that I've explained this, let me see how much time we've got. We've got, I think, about half an hour or so, I think. Yeah. Let me now explain to you. So what we did was we created a model for this. And I'm not going to bore you with the theory behind the model, except to say that when you're presenting your research to a top-level journal, you really need to have a strong theoretical foundation for it. We could describe all of this, and the theoreticians would come and say, so what? Okay, wonderful practice-based story. From a research point of view, what's your research contribution here, right? And so we decided, right, if you're an information systems academic like I am, you're basically thinking between 3 types of models. You're thinking, is this going to be a variance model, a process model, or a conceptual framework, right? And we said to ourselves, this is definitely not a variance model, right? In fact, when we set out to do the case study, we were like, we're not doing a variance model, right? And that's because variance models are more attuned to surveys, individual people filling out survey forms, and it gives you as an outcome a framework that's about correlations and doesn't give you any real practical benefit. So we wanted to build a reference model for all organizations to understand and to mimic, right, as a gold standard. So we decided to go for process model because as a process, we wanted to show the transformation or the transition between stages, right? And we chose situation awareness theory because it's a very well recognized and well respected theory. And the theory basically says that if you an individual, a human being, their situation awareness builds in 3 stages. First of all, they have perception. So for example, they look around and they can see what's going on. That's perception. Comprehension is stage 2, which is once they understand, once they can identify what's going on in their environment, they can make sense of it, right? That's comprehension. And then projection, which is if you're in a combat environment, then you really want to understand what's going to happen next in my environment so you can make a good decision, right? That's projection. So we thought because the situation awareness theory came from the air warfare combat, domain, right? US Air Force, we said this is going to work really well. So, but we will interpret it for an organization, not a human, in an organization. Okay, so let me now explain what's going on here. We want to explain how does the organization identify what is going on in the environment, How does it make sense of what's going on? And then how does it make a decision about what the attacker is doing so they can make a decision on their own side to circumvent that or to combat that? And the way we want to show it as a machine, right? We want to explain to practitioners, how do you build, what's going on in that machine? And to researchers, like from a work systems point of view, what does the system or the information processing system look like? Okay, so we decided that there are three stakeholders. There's junior analysts, we put level 1, level 2 together, senior analysts and the leadership team, and 3 stages to the organization: perception, comprehension, projection. And basically what we're saying here is the organization's perception comes from all of the analysts and the leadership team basically collecting raw data, whether it's from individual devices or from the entire IT operations, or whether somebody taps the security leadership team members on their shoulder and say, are you watching, FireEye or so forth. And then they make sense of it, comprehension. And the comprehension, we've modeled this in greater detail, is basically by constructing the idea or the understanding of what is going on in the incident environment, which means it's the triaging of the outcome, assessing the criticality, going through the playbook, using your mental models, creating a view, right? That's what's going on. And it's happening at a device level, at an operations level, and at the business perspective level, right? It's happening by different people, and the ticket management system is the glue between it, right? And then the security leadership team by themselves, without any other analysts participating, will go into their war room and they'll construct the scenarios. They'll come up with 3 or 5 different things that they think might be happening, and then they'll take a decision based on that, right? And the whole point of this model is to say, look, you see, if an item comes through this enterprise data security service, it basically goes up the ladder, incident escalation. It starts at level 1, then it goes to level 2, then it goes to level 3, then it goes to the security leadership team, then it goes to the executives. But at the same time, it can go backwards as well, right? It can start at the leadership level with somebody saying, hey, we're going into business merger, is there a risk? And these guys at the leadership can say, hey, level 1, look at what's going on in the network. Do you see a pattern from a particular part of the world that suggests that we might be attacked by organized crime, right? So the Security Operations Center is multi-threading on all these different things happening simultaneously. And it's only able to do so because the Operations Center works in this way, right? And these arrows are not just there for to be pretty. They're there because there is interaction happening, movement happening between these concepts and these boxes by every stakeholder and at every level, right? The level 1s and 2s, they have situation awareness of IT systems, but they cannot see, so individual IT system, but they cannot see the entire operational environment. Level 3 can see the entire operational environment, but they cannot see the business perspective. And the leadership team sees the business impact, and they're less concerned about the technology impact because they're looking at it from the business perspective. Okay. Now, having said that, here's the problems. Now, we were not just interested in explaining to the world how they do it, we wanted to talk about their problems. So what are the things that they tell us they cannot do? Because if they can't do it, then these are real research problems, right? Some stuff that technology vendors have not solved, that nobody has solved, and most likely researchers really need to be focusing on. So I'll talk about not all of them, but some of them. The key technological barrier is information overload. And that's because although they're protecting the IT infrastructure from attack, the technologies that they use for the protection are creating a lot of that problem. One key problem is threat intelligence boxes. They speculate so much that they create that fog for them that they have to sift through. The security tools they use, they don't integrate because they come from different vendors. Okay, that's a second huge problem. The third problem is that they acquire so much technology at such a rate that they can't protect themselves from the acquisitions fast enough. Okay, so technology complexity and rate of adoption is faster than rate of protection from that technology. Okay, the next thing is the technologies that do all the security work provide very little incident context. So they'll tell us what the alerts are, but they'll couch the alert in technological terms, right? So if you've looked at the log entries for your laptop or your IT system, you'll see that it's all engineering terminology. You cannot see the business impact because there's no context, right? That's their biggest problem. And because they lose their people, so quickly, they lose people every 6 months, the people who are working for them usually don't, the junior SOC analysts, don't stay long enough to have enough organizational knowledge to be able to interpret these log entries, right? That's a big problem. So you see a lot of log entries, a lot of incidents getting pushed to senior people because they have been there long enough to interpret them, okay? So they adopt a lot of vulnerable technologies, and the fit between the tools and the environment is not great. I kind of covered them. From a process perspective, it's very interesting to see that there's only one security team in the whole organization, and that's the IT security team, right? There's no physical security team, and there's no human resources security team. So if the incident involves an insider, and the insider, for example, has a gambling problem or some kind of addiction, the human resources team will not tell the security people that, right? There's no HR team, and the HR people do not understand that they have a security role. And the physical people, the physical security people, are all actually just guards inside buildings. And if somebody comes and picks up a server and walks out, the guards are like, that's not our problem, right? We're here to man the doors and look at the identity access control. We don't know what box does what, right? So that's another problem. So they should have a cross-functional security team, but they don't. They only have an IT security team. The IT assets that are attacked, they don't know which assets are high in the business criticality rating compared to other assets. So all the IT assets look the same to them, which is a huge problem. At the time that we were doing the case study, they were saying that they're going to start integrating business criticality ratings into the IT assets. So when an alert happens, they can tell if the alert relates to a high priority asset or a low priority asset, not just any asset, okay? Incident response lacks visibility over certain parts of the firm. This is a very interesting conversation, and basically goes something like this. The organization has different classes of people. The most valued people are the business side of the organization because they are revenue generators. The second class of people is IT because they are a cost center. And when IT tells business to do something, business usually tells them to go away, right? And business parts of the organization frequently set up their own IT systems without telling the security people. So when an incident happens and an IT system that's outside of their view, they're completely blind, right? They call them blind spots, right? And this happens a lot, right? Because incidents basically spill over to IT systems that the businesses have spun up and they have no control over them, right? Removing middle management was great because it increased the speed of the swiftness of their response, but it created new problems because without middle management, they didn't know how to get access to certain parts of the organization, right? It's basically saying like the middle management was acting like a yellow pages, right? And they threw the yellow pages out and they didn't realize now that those relationships are gone as well. And they don't know who to talk to when, okay? And lastly, huge knowledge sharing barriers amongst responders. The responders themselves had a culture. They wouldn't talk to each other necessarily. They wouldn't share knowledge. And so there were all sorts of gender, cultural, age-related issues that created, barriers. And of course, there's a cyber skills shortage around the world. And if you have been working at this organization, you become in demand, and therefore you leave and you get a better job somewhere else. That was the problem. And of course, when you've had an incident that's been running for a month, then there's burnout. And when there's burnout, people either leave or their cognitive function declines, and then they don't perform well, right? Okay. My last slide, is basically some of the things that we do in our team. Having done these case studies, we are in the business of making films at the moment. We made 3 films. They're short, 10 minutes each, basically showcasing an organization just like the one that I talked about. And our last films won all these awards, these film festival awards. We spent about 200,000 Australian dollars hiring professional actors, getting film directors, and making these films because these films really help to showcase what is going on inside an organization, right? The films that we made showed an attack on an organization from the eyes of the managers and explained how the managers were not connecting the dots and how the impact was experienced. And then we created a second film to show why the attackers did it for business reasons. What was their business strategy for doing the attack or hiring hackers to do the attack for them? And then we did a third film about a consultant who would go into the organization, see their security, and then help them to understand what their issues were, right? So we've done that. And then we've also built a whole series of micro-credentials on security management and courses for our own students. We do a lot of executive training, like the one that I'm doing right now, to give these, to explain these ideas and to address these issues. Okay. So finally, just before we get to Q&A, what did we do? We described the role of cybersecurity in protecting organizations. So you know now asset, threat, risk control. You understand prevention and response, right? And now you can analyze. If anybody says to you, hey, I've got a cybersecurity problem, you can immediately analyze it. What's the asset, right? Where's the value? What's the value of the asset to the organization? Who's the threat? What's going to happen when the threat impacts the asset? What's the risk scenario, right? What are the controls in place? How are you dealing with the scenario? And are the controls working well enough to reduce our exposure, or do we need to put more controls? Or is the exposure low enough that we can absorb it, right? Those are the questions that a strategic level manager thinks, right? We discussed the nature of the challenge, how APTs and actors create huge, sophisticated, experimenting innovation challenges. And we identified what the controls are, from technological controls to physical controls to process controls, etc. And we talked about what some of the best practices are in cyber defense in a case study, which I hope that you enjoyed and understood. And I'll stop talking there and we can take questions.
Questions, maybe I'll go through them one by one. The first question says, how and where social engineering can help in organizational defense?
Okay. Yes, please do link. I have people already doing LinkedIn requests, which is great. So social engineering. When we say social engineering, we usually mean attackers using very smart social techniques to get people inside the organization to do their bidding, right? So if your question is, from a defense perspective, how do we deal with social engineering attacks, which I think is the intent of the question, then that comes down to training, which is a big part of it. It comes down to recruitment, selecting people, the right people to do in the right roles. And it comes down to understanding what parts of the organization are the most sensitive bits. So let me give you an example. If we're a big pharmaceutical firm and we're about to spend a lot of money developing the cure for COVID, where is this cure going to be developed? It's going to be developed in the R&D division, right? So in the R&D division, we are going to be very careful about who is working on this project. We're going to map out the innovation process to say, okay, idea generation, idea experimentation, prototyping, commercialization. These are the phases of the innovation process. And in each of these phases, we're going to think, okay, where is the risk that somebody is going to steal this, right? We'll identify the phases, then we'll say, okay, which persons are we going to recruit to work in each phase? And we need to hire people and train them because they're going to be attacked using social engineering techniques. And if you've been following what's been going on with COVID, there's particular countries that have been not just attacking the pharmaceutical firms, but attacking the scientists using social engineering techniques to try to figure out what that formula of the COVID cure is going to be so they can replicate it in their country, right? So the point is that you need to combat social engineering, but a social engineering attack on an individual, on one individual is not the same as another individual, right? If I'm the attacker and I want to get access to a particular asset, I'm not going to go and socially engineer somebody who's got no access to the asset, right? I'm going to try to create that chain from the person that I attack to the next person, to the next person, to the person that's got access to the asset. So you need to do that as a cyber defender to figure out how are they going to find their way to this asset? How are we going to prevent them from having that foothold inside the organization? Let's do the training for social engineering, right? Let's train people to recognize what are the questions that people should or should not be asking you and how to answer a question when you're asked something that might be sensitive, and what happened, and who you should report it to if you're asked a question that might be sensitive. Social engineering attacks work because they work in compartments. If I want to know the answer to what's 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, I'll do a social engineering attack for each of those ones until I get 5, right? And the point is the person who's attacked doesn't realize what the bigger picture is that's being pieced together. So all of these people that are being socially engineered, they need to report their experiences. So there's one person in the organization that's getting all the reports, and they can put the pieces together and say, attackers from this country is after this asset. This is why they've done the social engineering attack on 5 people, right? That sort of thing. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Professor Atif. The second question says, I think you mentioned in the previous presentation about customized threat defense. So she's asking, is there any procedure for that? I think she's asking about customized threat defense and how to detect and maybe use such procedure in a bigger setup.
So the point about customized threat defenses, right, is not about individual technologies. Like, let's buy an intrusion detection system that's a customized threat defense, right? It's about mentality, about processes, about teams, about practices, about structures, organizational structures, right? That's what we mean here. This is not about buying a particular piece of technology, right? Because technology will never solve the problem of customized threat intelligence, right? It just cannot do it. The reason why these threat actors are so successful is because it's not about the sophistication of the attack, it's about the context. They are exploiting what's going on in the organization to the advantage, right? And the organization needs to be able to figure out how to create that customized environment where they can identify who the threat actor is, what their motivation is, what their capability is, and how to combat them, right? That's the key thing about it. So there's no procedure as such, but there is a transformational process, right? So organizations, first of all, will start usually, let me go, where is that diagram? Hold on. Usually here, by building a threat intelligence team, right? 4 to 6 people, usually defense people. They come from the military. They understand what threat intelligence is. And we're not talking about computer scientists here. We're talking about people from the army whose job it is to go through reports and to analyze the intelligence value and figure out which is reliable, what the quality of the intelligence is, what it all means, and then to figure out how to integrate that with level 1, level 2, level 3. We're not talking about, sticks and all those other, threat intelligence platforms and frameworks that most organizations use. We're talking about defense people who are integrating into these technology responders, right? That's the first thing you do, is you create this team, you train this team to work with the SOC so that people can then understand how to detect patterns and what that means from a means and motivation perspective. That's phase 1. Phase 1 is we've got the threat intelligence team and the operations team is now working with them. We are now sending out CTI, cyber threat intelligence alerts to the business, to the executive, to everybody to say, look, this is what's going on. This is the alert. We need you to do these things, et cetera, et cetera. Phase 2 is then realizing that the business is not going to respond to your alerts because they don't respect you, because you're technology and their business, right? Phase 2 is doing the cultural transformation. And that means bringing in military people to work with the business side to get them to understand the value of intelligence and to work with them to draw out the valuable threat intelligence information coming from IT operations division, right? You have to understand that business risk and technology risk speak different languages. So that's the next phase. You have to be able to get the business people to understand what's going on in technology operations and to respect it, and then to take action and to share the risk with technology operations. If the business feels that cybersecurity is a technology problem, then they will expect technology operations to take all the risk, right? And the business will take no risk. Whereas what should happen is the risk should be shared by business and IT, so both of them will be incentivized to do things. That's the transformational process. I hope that made sense.
Thanks, Dr. Atif. I can see also there is a number of questions in the chat. One of them says, how to measure level of users cybersecurity awareness? Is there any best practices or framework from your experience?
Okay, I haven't been involved myself. Some of my students have been involved in measuring cybersecurity awareness or in doing research in that area. There certainly is a lot of research in the area of education, training, and awareness, but I don't have any specific frameworks. If you send me a message on LinkedIn, I can certainly look that up and get back to you. Let me see if I can quickly show you something that will make a whole lot of sense. I think one of the most interesting stories here is around cyber threat intelligence and how how we can learn more about getting organizations to do something in that space. So what I want to talk about is I recently worked on a paper. I'm working on a paper that is under review at the European Journal of Information Systems. So it's not published yet. So please do not take this and go anywhere with it. But what we were trying to do was we wrote a paper about threat intelligence as innovation. So how does an organization adopt threat intelligence? And this is the same case study organization. And the cyber strategy lead for it worked with us as an author to write a paper about how he transformed the organization to create a new culture where they would take cyber threat intelligence seriously and they would act on it. Okay, so I'm going to show you something really interesting. We wrote a paper, and in this paper, we basically told two stories. Story number one was the same story that we've told you, except we focused on threat intelligence, which is that the organization adopted threat intelligence as a special team and then integrated it into the security operations center that was there previously and created a new culture of threat intelligence going to all the business domain heads to say, okay, you need to take this seriously. And then at the end of phase one, they realized that it didn't work. And it didn't work because, and I'll give you a very specific example. This happened in this organization. There was a threat intelligence came from, I think it was the National Security Agency in the US. And a lot of these threat intelligence alerts say what the threat is, but they don't tell you who the threat actor is, right? So they relayed the threat intelligence to the head of a number of business domain, people. And the business domain heads basically came back and said, look, this is speculation, right? Okay, this is a threat. You say that our servers that are mission critical, that the entire business is running on, is particularly susceptible to this type of attack. You know that we have a vulnerability, but the attack hasn't happened yet, and we suspect that it's not going to happen. If you say that we must bring the server down so you can patch it, we say that bringing a server down is going to reduce our uptime, which is our key KPI. Okay, so we would rather take the risk and keep the server running because it's not our risk, actually, it's your risk. And you guys can figure out how to prevent the attack from coming to us. Okay, so this became a huge problem for the threat intelligence people, because what it meant was that even when there was a verified threat intelligence and the attack was imminent and they knew that they had a vulnerability, they could not convince the business domain managers to act on it, right? Why? Because the business domain heads, from their point of view, their KPIs said keep the mission critical server running 99.9% of the time. Do not bring the server down no matter what happens, right? Because that affects your profit margins and your profits. Okay, so then what did they do? We reported in the paper that this organization then did a survey of all the domain managers and asked them, why do you not take us seriously? And it came back that they didn't trust the threat intelligence because sometimes the threat intelligence was not correct, because the threat intelligence didn't come at a timely fashion. And they couldn't understand the threat intelligence because the language was not business threat intelligence, it was technology threat intelligence. So the cyber threat intelligence people then decided that they were going to definitely do something about it. But here's the really interesting thing. When we sent the paper to the journal, they came back and said, this is an interesting story, but you need to explain to us what is the evidence that the organization actually transformed so their security was better as a result of adopting threat intelligence, right? So you've told us a story about adopting threat intelligence. It's a very interesting story. We'll give you that. It's fascinating. We'll give you that. But you need to show us evidence that the organization's cybersecurity improved as a result of adopting threat intelligence. Now, this is a crazy, crazy thing to ask somebody, right? Because as you know, in security, it's impossible to come up with objective measures of improvement, right? If I'm an organization and let's say I'm experiencing 100, attacks a day, next month I experienced 10 attacks, and the following month 20 attacks. I could say that the change in the number of attacks, right, is because of my superior defenses, right? But I don't know because I don't have any information about what's going on in the threat environment. So in a sense, what we're saying is you cannot measure cybersecurity performance by the number of incidents that you've had because you don't know how many attacks are actually behind the incidents. It's impossible. So we cannot give them evidence. And the reason why the reviewers asked for this evidence is because they're not security people. So what we did was we came with proxy evidence, right? This is evidence that is about how the organization's changed its behavior, but it's very interesting because it's the closest thing that you'll get for actual hard evidence that the organization has improved its cybersecurity posture, right? And the main evidence was that we found that the organization spent the amount of time that they spent at the end of the kill chain. Now, you remember what kill chain is? It's the attacker going through reconnaissance, penetration, exploitation, etc. In the past, before threat intelligence, the organization was spending a lot of time defending themselves in the last phase of the attack. After threat intelligence, they began to spend a lot of time in the early phases of the attack. So preventing the threat actor from completing their recon and getting to the organization's external environment, right? This was incredibly useful evidence, right? Imagine this, right? You're spending a lot of time, basically putting out fires. Then you have threat intelligence. Now you know who the threat actor is. Now you're preventing the threat actor from actually attacking you, right? By building your shield in a different way, by doing all these sorts of things, never allowing the attack to progress to the end stage. This was very good proxy evidence for us. The second thing we discovered is the attack surface became bigger, right? Because the organization began to recognize how big their attack surface was when they started to work with business more closely, right? So this is also an indicator, an early indicator of threat intelligence working for you, right? If you have good threat intelligence, you will have a much better view of your attack surface. If you have good threat intelligence, you will spend less time at the end stage of the attack and more time at the early stage of the attack, right? So those were our two big evidences, and that's about all I'm going to share for this. Okay, stop sharing.
Thanks, Professor Atif. My session crashed, so I came to another friend's room to ask the last question. It's very interesting. It's about there's a money involved. It says how organizations respond to ransomware. It's about the ransom. We have seen many stories. So, what is your?
Okay. That is a very, very difficult question because ransomware ties up your IT infrastructure so you can't use it. So I asked this question to the cyber strategy lead of this organization, right? Because somebody asked me this question from one of my former consulting firms. They were developing a ransomware policy and they said, look, we're developing a ransomware and kidnapping policy, and we want to know whether our strategy works, right? What do you think? And I asked this firm, so what's this firm's ransomware strategy, not the response strategy or ransomware strategy? And they said, look, our strategy is that we have a cloud-based redundancy across all critical infrastructure services in our organization, right? So everything that is core to us, that we need to be able to function, we have redundancy built into the cloud, right? And I said to them, well, actually they said it's built into a private cloud, right? For which we have a contract and, with one of the leading telecommunications carriers, and they provide us the assurance. And I said to them, what if that private cloud provider gets ransomware as well? Then what? Well, he said, well, then we have actually a second backup, AWS, right? And Microsoft. And I was like, okay, so what happens if they're also, ransomware? And his answer was, if AWS gets ransomware, then you have a bigger problem than your ransomware, because it means the entire internet is ransomed, right? So you don't have to worry about your own organization. So for your risk exposure, your basic thing is you need to create that redundancy and that hot cross, okay? So not just, oh, we have a private cloud and we've got, critical infrastructure there as well. You have to be able to switch to it at a moment's notice, which takes a lot of practice and a lot of investment, which they have made.
Yeah, thanks. We all should be ready for, this ransom thing. We should have a strategy. I mean, every setup, even it's university or it's a big like Aramco, etc. So we should have a policy how to deal with such things. Very interesting. I think the time is up. Now I will request Professor Dr. Abdulrahman, my dean, to formally thank you and conclude this session, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Nasser, and I'd like to thank you, Dr. Atif, for sharing your extensive experience and all your research. It's very interesting to see all the strategies to deal with cybersecurity, especially with the large scale that you mentioned, about 20 billion attacks per day, and also the importance of having the structure, how to deal with these attacks, and also the role of threat intelligence. I believe with this large scale, the human could not manage it, and having threat intelligence will assist us, greatly. So I believe having this overview give a great value to all the audience. I would like to thank the audience also for their engagement and for their participation. And I'd like to thank Professor Nasser for moderating this session. Thank you again, Dr. Atif. We really enjoyed the session and looking forward for more collaborations and more engagement with you and with your center. And would like to thank also Dr. Munir Sheikh, who introduced us to you, and I believe we're looking forward to work with you and with him, inshallah, in the future.
Thank you very much. And my thanks to yourself, Dr. Al-Muhaidib and Professor Nasr bin Allah, and to Munir for introducing us. And inshallah, plan is for us to collaborate in the future. Jazakallah khair, barakallah feek to you, to all of you for attending.
Thank you, Dr. Atif, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, inshallah, we will send you a follow-up email. I will send a survey in a few future collaborations, maybe some other initiatives where we need your help. So inshallah, you will get my email shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.